Welcome as we continue our lessons on critical race theory. We are in volume five. I am Dr. Khabir. And this week we will be discussing some of the laws and or challenges. And as far as the theory goes, resistance and things that will be done to counteract or to stop progress as we look at critical race theory from the perspective of challenging the stage that we're entering into. And the stage that we're entering into now, we're seeing resistance. Now, as a historian, as someone who looks at data, resistance throughout time has always taken shape in the form of a resistance to some sort of law, statute, charter, power, authority, etc. In America, we are ruled by what is called the rule of law. Now, the rule of law simply states that the law should apply to all evenly and equally. However, we know that America does not apply the law evenly or equally to everyone. But as a theory goes, when the law is not applied evenly or equally to everyone, then how do we who are receiving the unequal treatment respond? Now, if we look into the Constitution of America, the First Amendment gives us the freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech has always been challenging to those in power because those in power, to keep their power, need people not to be able to speak about the issues that affect them. Meaning you have the right to speech, but you also have the right to petition your government for a redress of a grievance. Meaning you did something I don't like. Here is the process to resolve it. That can be elections, that can be petitions, it can be direct action, it can be protest. However, when we see it on the far end of the spectrum, the ultimate resistance becomes conflict and or violence. In order to alleviate conflict and or violence, we have to have even playing fields, because when one side uses the laws to harm or hinder the other side, then you leave individuals who are harmed with little redress. So the right to assembly is also that First Amendment right. Now, what most people do is they look at these rights as independent and separate of each other. However, it's important to look at these rights as a combination or culmination of all things coming together as like puzzle pieces. So I have the freedom of speech. I have the right to petition my government for redress of grievance. I have the right to assemble. And then ultimately, I have these rights that are enshrined in this document called the U.S. Constitution. And in the event that they do not provide me these protections anymore, then other rights were ultimately added. Some people think that the Second Amendment was designed if the First Amendment fails. Now, the Second Amendment is the right for the people to keep and bear arms, the well-regulated militia. Now, going back to critical race theory, we have to understand that the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution for the purpose of putting down slave rebellions and revolts. The southern colonies believed that if there was a slave rebellion, the North militia would not come to their defense because the people would not have a standing militia. So one of the reasons for the Second Amendment in this country was to put down those rebellions in the event that they were to arise as insurrections. And this goes back to why we see some of the first black codes in America were designed to restrict ownership of black people with owning guns. But let's go a little further. As we look at these amendments, we see the Third Amendment talks about quartering troops. The Fourth Amendment gives you the right to be secure in your home and your property. Because these amendments, once you start to see power challenging, you start to see that there were certain people in this country who were never designed to be secure in their home and property. Going back to the plantation, you could always see a paddy roller or a slave patroller was authorized to enter into the dwelling of an enslaved person to see if they had contraband, anything that would allow them to escape. If they had books, if they had extra food, if they had anything in their knives, weapons, they could be confiscated, and there was no protections from the law because these tools would help people rebel. And so in order to rebel, you have to stop the individuals from having the same rights that will allow them to rebel. And there goes where we intersect theory. Because before you rebel, you need theory to understand the most effective way to rebel. And the first way you rebel is the way that they rebelled in 1776. They, founders of America, wrote their name on a document called the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, they said what their grievances were. And usually theory starts from explaining a phenomenon, but nothing creates division as succinct as a grievance. That's why the First Amendment says you have the right to petition your government for redress of a grievance. And a grievance in that context will be a harm. So when we look at the harms that have been done to people of African ancestry in America, we have to say, well, the first thing we have to do to keep them aware is to not know the harms that were done to them. Because if they don't know the harms that were done to them, then they cannot ask for a redress of grievance. And that is why critical race theory is being so attacked so vehemently, is because it is saying a grievance was done. But not only was the grievance done, the grievance still continues and persists to this day through its law, through its structure, through its code. Now, philosophy, ideology, and we see what happens when you have resistance from people who are not designed to resist. You start to see force and or violence. So when they needed to make examples of enslaved people, usually when they captured them, they would cut off their foot. Cutting off their foot symbolized you were not able to run away. They would brand you as a runaway. Usually they would put a mark on the skin, usually on the face or easily recognizable area, to let others know that you were a runaway. And this is why skin tone in America became the most effective process for creating slaves, because it easily identified a group of people who could be subject to race control. Now, contrary to popular opinion, everyone enforced the slave codes, because the slave codes were required so that everyone that was non-enslaved could have peace of mind. Skirting these laws meant violence to you personally. And that's why you didn't see a lot of allies who were helping Black people enslaved, notably a few, John Brown. We had Mary Childs. They had very prominent abolitionists, even some white Southerners who did not like the practice of slavery, but understood that to go against the social norm would cause problems to themselves. And so self-interest becomes the problem when we look at theory and collectivity, so that we can bring forth agreement and understanding amongst the whole community. Now, in reference to critical race theory, understanding the law, which is why if you are a lawyer and you are Black in America, you understand that laws are like spider webs. They exist for the weak and the small, but the big ones run right through it. We saw this just recently with Trump, and we saw how he had been convicted of 34 felonies, but served no jail time, because we understand that conceptually, no matter what we think or don't think about the law, it is there as a tool to keep those with power in power. And in order to challenge the power, you must first use their constructs, which is the law. Now, understanding that you will not get equal treatment under the law, because there is a felony of fairness in this country, and we understand that that fallacy exists to perpetuate negative stereotypes against certain people as if they are criminal. If you want to make someone criminal, all you have to do is, by the stroke of a pen, say the ideas and things that they do are unlawful. So during the Nixon administration, they wanted to outlaw hippies and criminals and Black people, etc. But they knew that they had no way of doing it. But they knew that these populations like to do drugs. So they said, if we outlaw the substances that these individuals use, now we can break up their meetings. We can infiltrate their organizations. Infiltration becomes a better form of invasion. We saw that with Judas and the Black Messiah with Fred Hampton in Chicago. One of the problems when it comes to theory is we have to understand that our adversary has more information than we do, because they understand that they can use the people who look like you against you. So we saw how the FBI were sending letters infiltrating MLK on his phone conversations. They were intercepting his correspondence to find dirt on him and ultimately trying to blackmail him to stop, leading these movements. They wanted him to commit suicide. They actually advocated him to do that because ultimately they knew that if he continued to speak, that he would continue to open the minds of people who would create like-mindedness, and then power needs to consolidate. And one of the best arguments to keep our cultures or population separate is the very old strategy of dividing and conquering. And that happens in one of two ways. One is words and word meaning of the law, meaning what a word meant in 1776 is not the same thing that word might mean today. And in order to hide these meanings, what has happened is you have to get specialized training and or education, and you have to pass what is called a bar, or you have to be qualified to practice. But these standards were only sometimes put in place to keep certain people out of these communities. So, for example, in certain states like South Carolina, in southern states, there was no requirement to pass the bar once you pass law school. That requirement was put in there as an extra barrier to keep people from accessing information and or data. And in the resistance, the idea that to teach someone a theory, it's not to teach necessarily resistance, it's also to teach understanding of their system, so that when things happen, they are not confused, they are not taken aback by when they see discrepant behavior. One thing that we are seeing right now is this term called DEI hire, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now we are seeing that the term DEI hire is not applying to all people, because people of European ancestry could be incompetent and unqualified, but we're not referring to them as DEI hires. We could have a Black person who is brilliant, Harvard educated, all of the credentials and all of the things, and no matter what, they're still considered DEI hire. Now, what does this do is it undermines people's characteristics of imposter syndrome, because you might feel that I do not belong here. Who am I to do such and such and so and so? And when you start to get under this system where accolades and credentials are so important, then you understand that you have to get these credentials and sometimes to speak in spaces to understand the constructs, because the people that you are sharing and disputing with and arguing may sometimes be ignorant and uninformed. And Handel's law says we should always attribute malice initially, not attribute malice where we can attribute ignorance first. And there are a lot of areas in this country where people are ignorant about, but it's purposeful ignorance. It is complicit ignorance, and it's conspiratorial ignorance, because our education system is not designed to teach the African knowledge of self. And I would submit to anyone that in order to get understanding of anything, you must first have knowledge of self first. And knowledge of self is saying, who am I? What are my challenges, my oppositions? Because the goal of education should be how to solve your problems. And if you find yourself not able to solve your problems, then you have not been properly educated. Now, what are some of the problems that we see in America is we see that there are stigmas associated to individuals who try to resist lawfully. So example would be when white individuals in this country feel aggrieved, they can take their rifles and their militias and go in state capitals and knock on the governor's door and say, give us what we want right now, under the threat or the force of coercion or violence. And we see that that is a privilege that is not entitled to others. And we knew this, we have experiments, we have evidence to document this. Because when the Black Panther Party went into the California State House with weapons, they were summarily arrested, and laws were passed to prevent that from happening again. That affected everyone. And we started to see legislation coming out to prevent certain behaviors. And when we started to see the legislation come, then we know that power is afraid when laws are passed to protect it. And when we study the laws and how they work in concert with each other, then we can take a step back and see that the unintended consequence of these laws ultimately validate the claims of the people making the argument. And that first argument would be, look, how has power been challenged historically? Um, European concepts are primarily what we have as evidence, because we see in Europe there has always been a constant battling of power and authority for dominating other people. Uh, the desire to want to dominate other people is very human. It is a very human thing to want to rule over people. But in order to rule over people, you must first be able to explain to them, why should I rule over you? Why am I eligible or have the ability to rule over you? Now, under this idea that you're ruling over people because you have the consent of the governed to do so. And when you give people the consent to rule over you, what you're essentially saying is, I am delegating my decision-making abilities to this individual. We saw that in European history, there was a lot of challenges because they had illegitimate people, where the king died, had no successor, and there was a war to determine who would be superior. And the question of superiority throughout most of history has been determined on the battlefield. It is the battlefield where people are determined supremacy. It's the only place where supremacy is okay. Now, what does the word war mean? The etymology, we look at our English word debate. A debate is a war. It's a war of words, which is why certain people who don't have arguments that are good do not want to debate you. People who don't have good arguments don't want to debate you. Try to sit down with a white supremacist and have an honest debate about Kemet, about Egypt, about European history, about the Moors, about Black influences on the world, about how Black culture has essentially been predominant and underpinning of the world society. Let's have that debate. But they won't. They won't have that debate with you, because they understand that war they will lose. So they have to hide behind their institutions and suppress your vote and your voice, which is why I wanted to make this introductory course in critical race theory, because you are seeing right now in real time what I am talking about happening. Meta just said we're not going to look up fact checks anymore. We're going to just let people say what they want to say. Now, freedom of speech in this country has been challenging. It's a quote that I love from Malcolm X. He says, if you are not ready to die for it, get the word freedom out of your vocabulary. Now, that is an important quote, because people talk about freedom, but they are not told what it cost. Going back to 1776, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they said, we, the signers, pledge our honor, our trust, and our fortunes on what we are saying. Meaning, it is a revolutionary act to tell someone what you will die for. It is a revolutionary act to tell someone where you shall not encroach. We all have individually determined things that we will not allow to happen to us. I will not hurt anybody, but if you break into my house, I can meet you with violence. But what about when you try to break into someone's mind with ideas? You are ultimately met with violence as well. But the tools to counteract someone trying to break into your ideology or your worldview is a contrasting idea. In that contrasting idea, we start to see people creating communities to support their ideologies. Because individually, you may not have a better argument, but if you can get your friends to come together with a bunch of guns and go kill people and murder your opposition, it doesn't matter that you don't have a better argument, because the people who were making the argument that were better than yours are 6 feet below the ground. And dead people don't make usually good arguments, because the living people make the arguments of the dead people. And what we are starting to see happening in America, especially when it comes to radicalization and extremism, why the pardons of the January 6th insurrectionists are so dangerous, is because what we're seeing is The idea that violence is not only the answer, it's the only way that the majority of people with power can suppress the minority. Going back to Bacon's rebellion in the 1670s, when the planter class was up at arms trying to figure out how can we who are in small in number keep power over the groups, meaning I am not going to have any argument or discussion or debate with any black person on any social media platform for whatever reason. I don't need to. It is not relevant because I will not be a tool for my opposition to bring division amongst people who are already divided. Now, I will talk to people in a one-on-one, offline, but there's a form for that. It's called solidarity, because ultimately people talk about unity, and I think that unity is too high of a bar for certain people. Solidarity means that if someone attacks you, they've attacked me. NATO in Article 5 says an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all the NATO countries. And if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. We saw this in the Montgomery Brawl, where an individual is being attacked, a black individual being attacked unprovoked, and black people came to his help. One dude jumped in the water and started to swim. And I swear it was the best moment I've seen in probably the last 20 years of solidarity, of people standing up for each other because something was wrong. Now, it wasn't because it was on a racial bind. It was because there was no coordination. You know, the one thing I like the most is that we have similar experiences sometimes. We have different experiences sometimes, but we know that jumping someone is wrong. We know that fair fighting is important. We know that fair fighting is important. We know that proportionality is important. That's why what's happening in Gaza is so important to talk about, because what the Israelis are doing is not proportional to what was done on October 7th. And proportionality without it is a war crime. Now, how can you do a war crime is I backed you into a corner, giving you no way to escape, so now you will fight harder, as what Sun Tzu said. And then Clausewitz talks about how politics is war by other means. So when we say politics is war by other means, then what we are essentially saying is that in order to create policy, we have to understand how to debate our ideas logically, how to understand historically what people with power do. People with power are insulated from the masses because their systems protect them from any direct accountability, any type of arguments. I don't have to hear what you have to say because you are not on my level. You don't have the position and or title. You don't have honorable by your name, where they have an issue when you're a doctor. The etymology of the word doctor means teacher. And as a teacher, the person who can teach is different than the person with the position, because I study what people have created to insulate themselves. And one of them is called soft power. One of them is the perception that you cannot challenge me. You are not knowledgeable, because if you were to challenge me, the unintended consequences will become violence to yourself. This is why Malcolm X said, if you are not willing to die for it, get the word freedom from your vocabulary, because power will kill you. They will. And it's not death in the sense of the body. Sometimes they can kill your argument. Sometimes they can kill your livelihood. Sometimes they can exile you and put you into another place, or remove your platform, or shadow ban you, or whatever they do. Which is why when I make these videos, I'm understanding that the times that we are in calls for people who did not want to speak to speak. You know, there are a lot of things that we could be doing with our time, but it's time to educate ourselves, because we have to understand that there is going to be something that happens, and this goes into our culture, how we are bred, how we are indoctrinated from our religious. You know, we were talking about obeying authority, you know, like the Bible and Quran talks about obeying authority, those who rule over you, submit to them. But what if they're a tyrant? Do you have to submit to tyranny? Because if you submit to tyranny, then you have no way to resist it. It's the Maccabees, if you understand the story about how they resisted the Roman rule, because resistance to tyranny becomes moral. It becomes the right thing to do, which is why when you see the Geneva Bible, the word tyranny is not in there. It's when authority is used in a coercive way. And that the sentiment is there, but the application of it is to not tell people that those in authority can be tyrannical, which is why King James, his son Charles I, had his head cut off because he was a tyrant. And people will stand up to tyranny once they can identify it. We see this happening with certain individuals who do not want to obey the law. They're called lawlessness and the lawless one, because lawless people need lawless followers because they will do the lawless deeds for them. Like if you look in World War II at the Wannsee Conference, where they had to come with a final solution. And the final solution was to just create genocide, because this is the end result of dehumanizing. And when you don't resist, you will be slaughtered. You will be slaughtered for resistance. You'll be slaughtered for not resistance. Now, it was Gandhi who talked about nonviolent resistance. Now, nonviolent resistance is a strategy that can be effective, but it was something that Stokely, Kwame Ture said that in order for nonviolence to work, your adversary must have a conscience. And conceptualizing what that means is hard if you don't have a theory, meaning what will people do for power and to retain and or keep their power? Throughout history, suppression of ideas, removing books. In Norway, they're teaching their children in school how to spot false information. In America, what we're doing is putting out false information and saying there's too much information to go over right now. It's called saturation. Like if you had a radar system that can track 10 targets at one time, all you'd have to do to defeat it is to shoot 11 missiles at it. And I think that's what's happening with critical race theory. People are saying so many things about it, just showing so many targets at it, but not realizing that the phenomenon that it explains is needed right now. That's why, Victor Hugo said there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And not only has the time come for the praxis, as we talked about in our last session, but what we're talking about now is understanding what those in power will do and understanding the process of how power responds to resistance. This is why the South succeeded from the Union, even though Lincoln was not interested in ending the institution of slavery. The mere thought that they could created a backlash or white lash to the institution being protected, because people with power become paranoid when they feel that their power can be taken from them through a process that they don't approve of. And when you take people's power from them who have it and they're accustomed to it, it will change how they view the world. And to not be on top of a pyramid will resort to violence. And my concern is you should never be the second person to realize that it is time to do violence. Let me say that one more time. You should never be the second person to realize that it is time to do violence. Man, that was a good quote. One more time for the record. You should never be the second person to realize that it is time to do violence, because the first person has already initiated the violence on you, and you will now be a second afterthought, because by the time you realize it is time to do violence, you have already been defeated. Now, violence tends to happen local first, local, tactical, in the community. Someone asked, what do we do in our community to help where we can? From my time in the military, we used to build what was called DFPs, or defensive fighting positions. And it was a 12-step process to build one. And the last stage was constantly improve the position. Constantly improve the position, which is why focusing on yourself is the best thing to do. Strategy, resistance. If you do not have a weapon in this country and are trained in order to use it, you will automatically be a disadvantage because your adversary has them. Not saying you need to go out and shoot every day, but you should be familiar with how to use a weapon. Because in theory, if you do not know how to use one, when it is time to use one, if needed, you will be at disadvantage because the people that you're up against may not be smart. They may not have a college education. They may not be able to wrestle good. They may be 400 pounds with a pot belly. But if they can shoot a rifle at 100 yards, you're a disadvantage. And so learning the laws, there was the movement called the NFAC, Not Effing Around Coalition, by Jam Master Jay, who was caught up because he got caught pointing his weapon at a federal agent to see where he was at. Knowing the law. See, had he known you cannot point your weapon at somebody unless you intend to shoot them, you're going to be at a problem and a disadvantage. Knowing the law, how the law operates, ultimately educating yourself on resistance, meaning if I have to use my weapon as a means of resistance to tyranny, and I'm following the procedures, then I need to know, well, what will I be doing when the law enforcement people come? What will I be doing? Me, I will be, once the scene is safe, I will be securing the weapon, and I will be trying to give life-saving aid to that individual. I don't care who they are. They could be the most racist grand dragon wizard of the KKK. I am going to be giving chest compressions, mouth to mouth, because when that police officer responds with their body camera on, hopefully, I am going to be seen providing aid to that individual if the scene is safe. If the scene is not safe, then I'm not going to be on the scene, but I'm going to be contacting those who are in authorities to let them know what is happening. Now, when I let them know what is happening, what will I be telling them? Nothing that they do not need to know. And in the praxis idea of law, you do not disclose information before it is needed. Let me say it one more time. You do not disclose information before it is needed. So your question may become, well, how do I know when the information is needed? From a critical race theory perspective, knowing the history of this country, we have to understand that the law enforcer does not need to know the law. And because they do not need to know the law, they can violate it. However, if it is done in good faith, the question that we run into is, how do I resist at the time of? Now, we know that if you are Black in this country and you try to resist law enforcement, there is a good chance that you will end up in a body bag. And because of that, the resistance usually tends to take place in the courtroom. And I find it insulting when someone tells someone who's poorly educated with no money, just wait for your day in court, as if to say, you do not know how the court system operates in this country. You're going to get a public defender who is overwhelmed with cases. You're going to get somebody who has about 10 minutes to talk to you. You might not see them to the day of the trial. They've had no time to review your case, submit evidence, ask for that motion to dismiss because the case was fabricated, and you're going to get caught up in the system. You're going to lose work. You're going to miss work, might lose your job. So now you have no means to actually resist. Now let's flip the script. I'm white. My dad owns a company. My uncle is friends with the mayor, the police chief, and my cousin went to high school. I'm gonna have a better outcome because the charges may not even get hindered to me. I've seen people get DUIs, and because they knew the people in law enforcement, they got a courtesy ride to their house. and the cop partner followed them home. And when you understand our system, you have to be able to understand that reality. Like right now, if the police came to my house without a warrant, busted in my stuff, stopped me from broadcasting right in this moment, what would I do to resist? What would I do? And because that question has to be answered before it happens, it has to be answered before. And if you don't know what to do, then you have to be prepared beforehand. The idea of parabellum, I mean, if you want peace, you must be prepared for war. And any theory that does not prepare you for war is defunct of your survival. Now, in this country, we know that the minority of Black people are a global majority, but in this country, we are a minority of people. And we have not created organizations to resist certain scale of attacks. We can handle one-on-one, but we are not prepared for big group armed oriented violence. We are not, which is why you are seeing organizations come together for community protections. This is what the Deacons of Defense were in the South, in Louisiana. This is what the Black Panther Party became, is that because if you cannot protect your community from external forces, then you don't have to worry about it. However, in the Black community in America, the concern isn't externality, the concern is internality, meaning the threats that most people are afraid of come from their own community. They're not afraid of the Ku Klux Klan coming and riding through their neighborhood, but they are afraid of the kid next door neighbor who has problems and is a threat to them and their safety because he's communicating threats to them. And that's why solidarity to me is more important than unity, because from the critical race perspective, it's the idea of what does it mean to be Black in this country, knowing that when someone says something like Black Lives Matter, the question then becomes when. And so in the course, which we have one more lesson, and looking ahead, the reason that I wanted to finish this course before January 20th is because after January 20th, there might not be a desire for people to resist. Because submission to tyranny is easy when you don't feel that it's going to affect you personally. You know, there are a lot of Black people who voted for conservative agenda for the Black conservatives who are the DEI person in their job. And they don't even know it yet. They think that their credentials got them there. And they may be the most highly qualified person there, have a PhD, doctorates, and expertise, postdoctorate certifications, work international organizations, and they don't need you anymore. Your expertise isn't needed anymore. They don't need a Black person at the table anymore. And when they don't need a Black person at the table anymore, you voted out your own job. And that's the irony of the intersectionality of racism, is because the word capitalism means pertaining to the head. And this last thought that I will leave with you all is this idea, is that the wealthiest people are the most knowledgeable ones. Now, I know we've been taught to think that wealth is what your bank account says, and that is true to a certain extent. But if you have no knowledge in your head, and I put money in your bank account, it will be gone quickly. This course is to give you capital. Capital is what you can keep when the bank is a run on the bank. And in our last episode, we will be talking about economics and critical race theory, because there is an economic component to this, which why we'll talk about Marxist thought a little more in depth in our last one. And not necessarily socialism, but we will talk about collectivism, the commune, The community. The word commune is where we get community from. But as capital is devised from our head, the people who have the most knowledge in their head have the most capital. Those who know things that others do not know. This is not esoteric. This is not secret. There are things that I learned in my PhD program that you just don't know. Maybe you don't want to know. You don't have to know. But I do know them. I know how to build ideas in people's head. And you must first start off with what is currently constructed. I cannot build anything into your head if I don't know how it was constructed. And I think some people lose sight of that. The ideas that you have in your head were constructed. Like somebody taught you that capital was money. And it is now. But the origin, if you go up to the Latin, if you look up the etymology of the word, it has nothing to do with money. It just evolved into money. But capital isn't here. It's in your thinking. It's your thinking that will get you wealth. It's your thinking that will get you to overcome and go beyond theory. Now, it's this idea, and I hear this often when people come to this country and they're like, well, why are the black folks still talking about race and racism? Look, I'm a third world immigrant from Ecuador, El Salvador, fill in blank name country, and I made it in America. Why don't those black folks just stop complaining about the history of the racism in this country? Now, I would ask you this. When you go to a hospital, and doesn't the doctor ask you, do you have a history in your family of this illness? If you go in there to get a treatment, don't they ask you your family history? Why? Why do they ask you your family history? Well, I'll tell you. They ask you your family history because if it happened to you historically, there's a good chance that it might be happening now. So Ecuadorian people, with all due respect, or anybody from anywhere else, and I just said Ecuador because I saw a post from Ecuador or whatever, but anywhere else in this world, when you come to America and you want to speak on the issues of black people, know our history. Know that we have people who still live on the plantation where they were born at, where their people were enslaved at. They never moved. They never learned anything. They didn't get that education that you speak about. They didn't get that information. So when people like me try to educate them and try to show them that what capital is, because when you get capital up here, you will not ask anyone for anything. I will not have to petition you for a grievance once I understand how theory works, how to build, how to conceptualize, and ultimately how to destroy. Like in Ecclesiastics, for everything and every purpose under the sun, there is a time for it. I have to know what time it is. And some people don't know what time it is. And you're going to find out. But a broke clock is right twice a day. But understanding how to use theory for empowerment is important. But the capital that we seek is here. But creating the capital and producing it, meaning the more you know, the more will be given to you. And although I have a doctorate, a PhD, I still seek knowledge every day, because to him who has much, more will be given. And I can only get more once I give out what I have to you, because the questions of the day arise. And how will we be organized, trained, and equipped? And those are the three most important things that I see with critical race theory. It is to organize us, it is to train us, and then to equip us so that we do not be the second person to know that it is time for conflict. It is time for adversary. And critical thinking is necessary for opposition. We need balance. We feed the trolls. We feed the trolls because we're hungry. And trolls taste good sometimes. Because their arguments are delicious. Because they're filled of logical fallacies, non sequiturs, reasoning that is flawed, and logic that is not based in epistemological evidence, not in empirical data, not in historical research, not in ethos, pathos, and logos. So take that with you. We will be finishing our last course next week. Be encouraged, being blessed. Happy New Year to you all. Go forth and prosper.